So our next sort of presenter or lecturer is somebody who I really rate and somebody who's very, very knowledgeable, but also quite zany.
I thought you were talking about me, Martin, obviously.
No, well,
Always.
that's you too, Ross. Professor Henrik Blomgren from KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden is our next speaker. He's waving at you there. It's kind of like a Eurovision sort of type effort now. But I had the pleasure of taking one of Henrik's class recently on Coursera. And actually, honestly, after taking the class, I felt I knew Henrik, and I called him up actually on a Saturday afternoon, and he responded to me in 10 minutes. And I asked, would he teach on our masters and address the Digital Academy Forum, and he was very happy to do so. Let me stop. The title of Henrik's most recent book is "Stop, Don't Anybody Move." Beyond the digital transformation. So I'll hand you over to Henrik, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy him and learn as much as I did in taking a class with him. So welcome, Henrik.
Thank you very much. Good morning, or good lunch, or good afternoon, so to speak. I got some very short slides. Let me try and see if I can make this visible.
Great, Henrik, we can see those.
You can see them?
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you.
I'll just take the opportunity and share some short slides. I think I'm pretty well aware of what you're up to when it comes to digitalization and healthcare. I think that you are the experts on healthcare. So I don't think I'm that qualified to say much about healthcare, except personal experiences. I happen to be born allergic. I happen to have visited, I think, 15 emergency hospitals all over the globe because of my peanut allergy, but that's just an anecdote. I'm an academic, but also a business interested person. And I've been spending quite a lot of time, several decades, trying to understand disruption and what digital transformation means. And I'd like to start off here, if you don't mind. This is a picture which is pretty old, but I guess most of you recognize the person. It's Christopher Columbus, the man that was the first one to travel left instead of right. And the reason why I show this picture is, I guess most of us got to know when we were young in school that Christopher Columbus did a mistake. He did a navigation mistake, because he actually ended up in Bahamas when he thought that he was in India, or at least the Middle East, where he was heading. But do you know what he did afterwards? He actually continues his journey. And then he came to what he thought was China, but it was actually Cuba. And then he continued his own journey one more step and thought that he actually came to Japan, but in reality, he actually ended up in Haiti. So he did not only do one navigation mistake, he did several navigation mistakes. And it's interesting to know that Christopher Columbus, in many senses, was one of the most qualified person to do that kind of journey. He's been studied a lot. And he actually used the most qualified map that existed at that point in time. But still, he did these mistakes. So why did he? Well, if you have a map like this one, which he had, it's not surprising that you make a navigation mistake. And I use this story in order to show the consequences of having the wrong kind of map. Because if we have the wrong kind of map, we will actually quite often misinterpret what we actually step on with our own feet. And considering the digital times we live in, there is a desperate need for new maps. And as long as we don't have these new maps, well, this is what will happen. I don't know whether you read this book from Lewis Carroll, who's actually, or was, a rather well-educated professor in mathematics. But here's a story about Alice in Wonderland. She ends up in a crossing, and then she meets the cat, and she asks the cat, which road should I take? And then the cat asks her back, well, it depends on where you want to go. And then she says, I don't know where I want to go. And then the answer is, which is very accurate. Then you can actually take any road you like. And it seems to me that during the digital times we live in, we quite often end up in this situation. We're actually not having a new map, and we're actually not even sure where we want to go. But that's possible to figure out. And that's why I like to tell you another story. It's the story about rabbits that once upon a time came to Australia. And this is a pretty good metaphor for what's happening with industries when digitalization arrives into it. And another word for digitalization here is actually the rabbit. I think it was the late 1800s. Rabbits arrived into Australia, and when the rabbits arrived, they were a totally unknown species to that kind of ecosystem. And since they had no natural enemy, they totally messed up the whole ecosystem. They really messed up. Actually, they partly still do. They're still working on getting rid of the rabbits in Australia, but a big change has already happened. And what happened was, roughly speaking, that it became a shake around, and all the species living in Australia had to find a new balance. And when the new balance arrived, it became a rather stable situation again. And this is actually a pretty good metaphor for what happens with nearly all industries when digitalization arrives. And another word for digitalization is actually the rabbit. Another word for the industry is actually Australia. And the arrow is actually a description of the process, meaning what does normally happen when rabbits, or actually digitalization, arrives to Australia, or actually industries. So it's possible to figure out, it's possible to make the map that Columbus should have had, but didn't have. Here's a small example from the healthcare industry that at least I find personally interesting. And I think that maybe you've seen these kind of services evolving during the last 5 to 10 years, so to speak. It's just a very, very low-tech, simple, more or less Skype connection. This is a Swedish company, and they're trying to become European. That's why they're called Levi in Europe. In Sweden, they are called Kry. It's just a simple Skype connection. You download the app, you connect to a doctor, you chat for a couple of minutes, you get a simple receipt. I mean, maybe you just had a flu and that's it. This is not technologically speaking rocket science. It's actually extremely low tech. So why care? Well, we could have actually asked the same kind of question once upon a time, like 1994 when Amazon started. This is the way their website did look at that point in time, and yeah, they only had books. And this is the way a music streaming service called Spotify, which happened to be Swedish, also did look in the beginning. And when they started, they didn't even have the Beatles. You know, it took them some time to fix that. The Beatles was reluctant to streaming. They had the power for it, so to speak. So in some sense, the simple Skype connection I showed you is in a similar state as Amazon once was, or Spotify once was. And what happens here in my Australian rabbit picture is actually possible to figure out because it normally happens in the same way. There's theory that actually can explain it to us. But let's take a look at this simple Skype doctor connection. What more could they actually do if they get customers? And by the way, do they have customers? Well, I think it's a bit different in different countries all over the globe, but I guess in most countries we can find them. In my country, they are big, tremendously big, and they have grown a lot. A particular place that they've used for advertising before Corona was actually airports. You travel down to Canary Island with your own children. They get a flu. How to get to the doctor? Connect to this service. So these services already have quite a lot of customers. And then the question is, could they do something more when they have customers connected? Do they actually already do that? Yeah, one thing that they do, which is pretty interesting, just a small detail, but still. Imagine you meet a doctor there with a simple Skype connection. And then that doctor says, I'm not really sure about your problem. Let me talk to a colleague. And then that doctor can connect to another colleague digitally somewhere on the globe. Maybe the best expert on the globe on this problem. That is pretty difficult to fix at a physical healthcare center, simply because they don't have that many colleagues. And then, of course, what else could they do? Well, here's what they have at least done in my country. They've started physical healthcare centers. And roughly speaking, in less than 2 years' time, they've become the biggest healthcare center in the whole country. Because they have a lot of people that's connected to the app and has been given the question, would you like to register on our physical healthcare center too? And most people said yes. And funny enough, the reason they did that was more or less because the government forced them to. Because the government thought they were cherry picking the customers, which they in some sense did. Now the question is, are they aware of what they actually could be up to? Starting off with a simple Skype connection, gradually making it more and more advanced. And finally, disrupt the whole healthcare industry. I think that's an open question. We will see. But I think it's worth asking them, why did they actually start with such a low-tech, simple Skype connection? And why did Amazon start with books? Well, there is actually a reason why Amazon did start with books. And Jeff Bezos actually said it. Already in 1997, there was an interview with a young guy called Jeff Bezos. You can find it on Vimeo. It's tremendously interesting. Because he explains why in specific he started off with books. But already when he started, he said Amazon is not a book company. Well, the reason why I started with books was that books in particular are unusually interesting if you want to do digital business when the internet connections are not that good, which they weren't in the beginning. It comes down to how many books does exist on the globe, so to speak. So all this follows theory. And a simple Skype connection can actually be a starting point for something big. And today, compared to the early days of the internet, we have quite a lot of people that knows how to play this game. On top of that, quite a lot of them also have quite a lot of money. The example I showed you, it's pretty well funded. It's not rookies who's running these companies. I seem to be knowing what they're up to. Having that said, the large contours of actually the digital future is actually possible to figure out. It's something I claim, and I know it's a really radical claim to do. I think I've heard like 10,000 times that I'm just crazy. But the point is, there is patents, there is theory. And going back to the picture of the rabbit, Australia, and the arrow, we just need to understand the rabbit, what we can do with it. We need to understand the process. And then we need to understand the industry in the case. Then we can actually draw the map of the future. And then we can figure out what will happen. And then we can figure out what we could do. So I think we actually can answer this question. And I don't think we have to do the same mistakes as Columbus. And I guess it's simply about, if we can figure out the big contours about future, we will have an advantage. that was my contribution. If you're interested in more, I give courses on this at Coursera. I've written books on it. Which correct, I call it Stop Nobody Move, because I think it's something that we can have use of, taking a short stop. And then I have a YouTube channel and a blog and everything else which digital people tend to have.
Henrik, thank you for a really sort of bright and zany and compelling talk. I think lots of things for us to talk about and to think about.
My pleasure.
So Henrik will also be lecturing on our Masters in Digital Health Transformation. So some of you will see Henrik again next month. So much appreciated, Henrik, and hopefully you can become a fixture in the Irish digital health ecosystem and help us.
Yeah, that would be fun.
We look forward to having you here face to face in the not too distant future.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks, Henrik.